Prior to the Civil War, African Americans had no rights because they had been enslaved for many years. Then came along the Civil War, which lasted 4 years for the abolition of slavery. The North fought for freedom, while the South fought to sustain slavery. After the war, at which the North had won, the 13th and 14th Amendments were put in place to eliminate slavery and give citizenship to the African Americans. But despite the creation of the 13th and 14th Amendments, equality for the African Americans was sporadic and undefined. In fact, the landmark Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson was a setback in freed blacks' rights that sanctioned segregation. This provoked African Americans to unite and begin a 60-year civil rights journey that influenced future court cases and provided opportunities of equality within the African American community.
During the Reconstruction period of the United States, many changes happened to the newly freed slaves. President Lincoln was put in charge of the Reconstruction to try to reestablish peace. He had tried to enforce acts to weaken the Confederacy, though he couldn't because the plans were rejected by Congress, and President Lincoln was assassinated before his ended term. After the assassination, Lincoln's Vice President Andrew Johnson was put in charge of the presidency and ultimately the Reconstruction. Johnson made the Confederate States abolish slavery, deny secession, and pay the Confederate debt. The Southern government answered harshly with black codes. One black code stated that if you were unemployed or homeless, you would be arrested and forced to pay a fine. If you were unable to pay the fine, you would be forced to do physical labor. As a newly freed slave, jobs and money were not easily accessible, thus met their objectives to take away the very rights that had been granted to the African Americans.
Many abolitionists had high hopes that the newly freed slaves would enjoy rights. Thus, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed in the House to abolish slavery. It states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to the jurisdiction." Still, another huge hurdle to equal rights had to be overturned. The Dred Scott decision, which stated African Americans were not citizens. This would happen in 1866, when the 14th Amendment was passed in the House. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S. Newly freed slaves now had rights, including access to the U.S. legal system that Dred Scott had been denied.
Along with the black codes, Jim Crow laws were put in place to take away African American social rights. An example of these laws were that they had to have separate facilities such as drinking fountains and bathrooms. Education and most public buildings were also separated by these laws. Even though many laws were enforced to keep down the African Americans, some activists emerged as leaders in the fight for equality. One activist was Booker T. Washington. In 1881, he founded the Tuskegee Institute. He believed that if African Americans got education, it would bring them out of the segregation hole. The plan was not enough, so Washington needed another idea. In 1895, he was invited to speak at the Cotton Exposition in the South. He proceeded to criticize all the people who were belittling the African Americans. He said, "In all things that are purely social, we can be separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress." The crowd became very attentive and took notice of his speakings.
Like Booker T. Washington, the Citizens Committee worked to help African Americans get socio-economic rights. They also helped fund many civil rights court cases. The Citizens Committee set out to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act, which required separate but equal accommodations for the African Americans in train cars.
It became apparent that the road to equal rights would have many stops. 30-year-old Homer Adolph Plessy was exactly the Citizens Committee had envisioned to get intentionally arrested. Ironically, Plessy was 7/8 white and 1/8 black. In 1892, Plessy proceeded to seat himself down in the whites-only passenger section of the train car. The conductor quickly approached Plessy and asked him to proceed to the black section of the car. Plessy refused the conductor and consequently violated the Louisiana Separate Car Act of 1890. Plessy was arrested, and the Citizens Committee hired Albine Wieninger Turgey from New York as the lawyer to defend Plessy on his legal challenge.
Trial first went to the Louisiana State Court, in which Plessy was found guilty. Even though Plessy was found guilty, he did not stop there. Plessy filed at the Supreme Court for his rights. At the Supreme Court, Plessy's lawyer, Turgi, argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. He also believed that the Separate Car Act was unconstitutional. Finally, they argued that the one-drop rule made difficult to determine one's race. It was important to note that Plessy was 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 black. Plessy believed that because of his white background, he should not have been arrested. John Howard Ferguson, the judge in the criminal district court case, didn't think that the Separate Car Act reestablished slavery or promoted the concept of inferiority. The 14th Amendment just gave the African Americans legal equality and not social equality. Also, the Separate Car Act was to keep public peace and was therefore reasonable.
After hearing both Plessy's and Ferguson's arguments, Henry Billings Brown delivered the final opinion of the judges. Legislation is powerless to eradicate racial distinctions or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States could not put them on the same plane. The Supreme Court judges also thought that since the two cars were equal, it was fine to have them separate. Additionally, they followed a civil rights ruling that found racial discrimination against African Americans in public imposes no badge of slavery. He was then convicted guilty, and the judges established the separate but equal clause in the law. It stated there could be separate facilities for blacks and whites, but they had to be equal. In other words, the government had just sanctioned segregation. However, history would show that the facilities for African Americans were unequal and inferior.
The decision sparked many reactions, for it allowed segregation to take place as long as accommodations were equal. Evidently, things weren't exactly equal. The African Americans needed something to jumpstart the fight for the equality of rights they sought. In 1909, Williams English Walling and Mary White organized the NAACP. It stood for National Association for the Advancement of the Colored People, and by 1918, the NAACP had grown to 43,993 members and 165 branches. The NAACP still exists today, and over the years they have fought peacefully for the African Americans by funding many court cases against segregation.
Despite the NAACP's workings for equality, there was still unfair treatment for the African Americans. As a result of this unfair treatment, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Houston fought for Donna Murray's rights by bringing a lawsuit against the University of Maryland, which was referred to as Murray v. Maryland. The premises of the lawsuit was that the university would not accept Donna Murray because of his race. Marshall, Houston, and Murray argued in front of the Maryland Court of Appeals that the African American universities were not of the same caliber of the University of Maryland, thus separate but not equal. The court listened to them and agreed with Murray. In 1938, Donna Murray graduated from the University of Maryland School of Law and became one of the most successful black lawyers and eventually sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court. Murray v. Maryland was not the only court case that fought against segregation. The Brown v. Board of Education case also attempted to make a change to the so-called separate but equal doctrine. This Supreme Court case addressed segregation in schools. Before the case, schools violated the separate but equal doctrine because the schools within Alabama were not equal facilities. After 5 months of argument between the lawyers, the U.S. Supreme Court came to a final ruling. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. After over 50 years of unequal treatment that was put forth by the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, 7 judges nullified its discrimination.
The Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896 changed history in many ways. It allowed segregation to take place, which then inspired African Americans to fight against these unfair treatments and start the civil rights movement, which eventually ended segregation for good.